My name is Ava Bennett. I'm 30 years old, and the day my father decided to throw me out, he didn't do it quietly, privately, or even with the basic dignity most people reserve for family. He turned it into entertainment. He made it a spectacle. When I pulled into the driveway to collect the last box I had left in the house, there was a giant vinyl banner stretched across the garage in bright red letters big enough for the whole neighborhood to read, "Goodbye. Freeloader. Don't come back." Asterisk. The grill was smoking. Music was blasting. People were holding paper plates and laughing like they had shown up for a 4th of July cookout instead of a public humiliation. Then somebody threw a hot dog at my car and yelled, "There's your final free meal." My father stood there in a ridiculous apron, smiling like he had finally won. I said nothing. I took one photo, got in my car, and left. 2 weeks later, that same man was calling me over and over, voice shaking, asking me to save him. If you only heard my family's version of me, you'd think this story was simple. You'd think I was exactly what that banner said. A grown woman still living in her father's house. No real job, no direction, no contribution, just another burden dragging down hardworking people who had already done too much. It was a story people loved because it made everything neat. It gave church women something to nod about over casserole dishes. It gave neighbors an easy villain. It gave my father a role he adored, the long-suffering, generous patriarch finally forced to be tough for my own good. The real story was less convenient. 3 years earlier, I had moved back into my father Richard Bennett's house after Bennett Graphics and Install started bleeding money in ways nobody outside the business could see. From the street, it still looked respectable. Trucks with branding, a workshop with activity, jobs going out, phones ringing. But behind the surface, things were unstable. Supply prices had climbed. 2 major clients dragged out payments. One commercial job got tangled in permitting delays. Bills started stacking on top of bad decisions. And bad decisions started breeding faster than anyone could fix them. My father's response to pressure had always been the same. He got louder. He got meaner. He blamed everyone in reach. The market, younger workers, regulations, cheap clients, immigrants, women in offices, technology, the weather, anybody but himself. He treated accountability like a foreign language. What he never admitted, what he probably never fully allowed himself to understand, was that I was the reason his company lasted as long as it did. I didn't have the kind of job my family respected, which meant I had no chance of ever being seen clearly by them. I worked remotely as a freelance bid coordinator and operations consultant. I helped contractors, maintenance companies, suppliers, and service firms organize vendor packets, clean up proposals, track deadlines, handle compliance paperwork, rewrite scopes of work, and keep documentation from collapsing before money was on the line. It was detailed, invisible work, and most people hated it. I happened to be good at it. I was good at noticing the tiny thing that would become a catastrophe 3 days later if nobody caught it. That skill made me valuable to clients and irrelevant at home. At first, helping Bennett Graphics and Install was supposed to be temporary. That was what I told myself. I'd clean up a few invoices, untangle a few vendor problems, get them through a rough quarter. But temporary has a way of becoming permanent when the people around you benefit from your silence. The first month, I reorganized accounts receivable and found invoices that had never been followed up on. The second month, I fixed a permit renewal issue that could have cost my father a municipal account. Then I discovered sales tax hadn't been handled properly. Then I found equipment leases set to auto-renew at rates so stupid they felt almost criminal. Then I realized one of the bookkeepers had left behind a mess that no one else had the patience or skill to untangle. Every time I solved one problem, 2 more crawled out from underneath it. My father never introduced me as the person stabilizing his business. He introduced me as his daughter who was figuring some things out. If I saved a job from imploding during dinner, he acted like I'd stumbled into usefulness by accident. If I negotiated with a supplier so they wouldn't freeze a materials order, he told relatives I mostly just answered emails. If I covered a payroll shortfall one Friday because he was too proud to admit he couldn't pay installers on time, he called it a little bridge, then laughed later and said, Families don't keep score. That sentence matters. Families don't keep score. People like my father only say that when the score would embarrass them. I didn't just buy groceries or chip in around the edges. I paid software subscriptions. I covered overdue balances tied to the workshop utilities. I handled insurance reinstatement fees on one of the trucks when the policy lapsed. I paid for rush shipping when materials hadn't been ordered on time. I floated vendor deposits that would have blown up active jobs if they bounced. I wasn't paying every bill. That would have been too obvious. I was paying the difference. The shortfall, the emergency amount, the number required to keep the machine from making enough noise that outsiders might hear it. And because I worked from a laptop, because there were no steel-toed boots and no sunburn and no sweat visible on my body at dinner. None of it counted in my father's moral universe. If he couldn't see labor, it wasn't labor. He would walk through the kitchen while I was on calls and say things like, "Must be nice," while I was trying to prevent a contract cancellation worth thousands of dollars to his company. He called my work my little computer hobby. Then an hour later, he would ask if I could rewrite an email because the client sounded irritated and he didn't know how to answer without making it worse. He treated my competence the way some people treat electricity. Embarrassing to think about. Essential when the lights go out. The rest of the family took their cues from him. My younger sister Kelsey learned early that mocking me earned approval. My uncle Dean hovered around the company after his own life stalled out. Doing some install work, pretending at sales, drinking too much, and making jokes whenever he felt threatened. My grandmother Lorraine covered every cruelty in church language and concern. That's the thing about toxic families. Nobody has to hold weekly meetings. Once the hierarchy is established, everyone knows exactly how to play their role. What changed was not their opinion of me. That had been settled long before. What changed was that my father started talking about selling the house and downsizing. And with that came a realization that hit me harder than any insult ever had. He believed his own version of events. He truly thought he had carried me. He thought the roof over my head erased every dollar I had spent. Every crisis I had fixed. Every hour I had lost. Because I had never turned my labor into an invoice. He had filed it away as nothing. In his mind, if I disappeared, the only thing missing would be my car in the driveway and my presence in the kitchen. Then one night I overheard him in the backyard telling my uncle and a neighbor that he was thinking about giving me 90 days to get out because maybe hitting bottom would finally turn me into a woman. They laughed. Kelsey laughed too. That was the moment something in me changed. I didn't feel dramatic. I didn't feel shattered. I felt clear. I didn't confront him. I documented. People assume revenge starts with rage. Mine started with spreadsheets. Not because I'm heartless. Because in families like mine, anger gets weaponized against you immediately. If you cry, you're unstable. If you defend yourself, you're disrespectful. If you raise your voice, you've just proved them right. Facts were the only language my father couldn't easily interrupt. And even then I knew he would try. So I started building a record. Not just of money, of dependency. I built a timeline going back 30 months. Every gap I had covered for Bennett Graphics and Install. Every software renewal. Every emergency order. Every permit fee I paid online because missing it would have shut down an approval. Every fuel card transfer. Every invoice I cleaned up before a client rejected it. Every bid package I assembled under my own freelance company access after my father missed the deadline and called me panicking. Every text that said, "Can you just take care of this one thing?" Every voicemail from Dean asking for a couple hundred just until Monday, so something wouldn't get repossessed. Every message from Kelsey asking if I could front her rent because Dad was stretched and she would pay me back later. Most of the time, she didn't. When I totaled 3 years of it, I sat back and stared. It wasn't just a big number. It was obscene. The direct company support alone was over $112 if I counted what I paid outright and the losses I prevented from becoming disasters. Personal family support pushed the number higher. Unpaid labor was harder to measure because labor like mine rarely leaves receipts. What's the value of catching a tax notice before the state freezes an account? What's the price of spending your nights rewriting bad emails so clients don't walk? What's the cost of keeping the household calm by staying up until 2 in the morning fixing administrative disasters no one else even knew existed? I printed the totals anyway. Around the same time, one of my regular clients in Colorado offered me a long-term contract. Not a formal full-time role, but stable enough to build around. Enough money to move. Enough to get my own place. Enough to stop organizing my life around people who only liked me when I was invisible and useful. I signed the contract, put a deposit down on a one-bedroom apartment outside Denver, and told absolutely no one. I rented a small storage unit near the interstate and started moving my things in stages so subtle nobody noticed. Winter clothes 1 week, books the next, kitchen equipment I had bought with my own money. The good monitor my father probably believed had materialized by divine favor. If that sounds calculated, it was. When you grow up in a house where every boundary becomes a debate, secrecy stops feeling dishonest. It starts feeling like breathing. My father beat me to the formal eviction speech by less than a week. He trapped me in the kitchen one Tuesday morning while I was reviewing a supplier compliance packet and told me he wanted me out by the end of the month. He used that tone some people use when they expect applause for cruelty. He said he was doing it because he loved me enough to stop enabling me. He said no respectable man would admire a woman still leaning on her father at 30. He said he was embarrassed when clients came by and saw my car parked there during business hours. He told me I needed a real job, my own place, and a wake-up call. I asked him one thing. Do you want me gone? Or do you want an audience when I leave? He smirked and said, maybe both. That should have been the moment I unloaded everything. It would have felt satisfying for maybe 10 seconds. But I knew how my father worked. Facts told in private would become fiction by lunchtime. He would call me unstable, vindictive, dramatic. By Sunday lunch the story would be that Ava tried to blackmail her own father after he lovingly encouraged her to become independent. No, if the truth was going to land, it needed timing. It needed consequences. It needed witnesses, even if those witnesses were just the aftermath. He gave me until Saturday. I nodded like a woman too ashamed to argue. What I actually did was finish removing anything valuable by Thursday. Friday night, I untied the last autopay backups I had quietly attached to company utilities and service accounts. I removed my card from the vendor portal. I notified a supplier that future emergency orders would require management approval. I sent out 2 overdue invoice drafts from the company email exactly as my father had instructed me to send them earlier in the week. Except this time I didn't translate his tone into something professional. I forwarded his words as he had originally written them. No softening, no cleanup, no Ava filter. It is amazing how quickly a person sounds incompetent when nobody is standing between them and their own emails. Then Saturday came, and I drove back for the last banker's box. People later asked if I was shocked by the party. Honestly, no, the banner wasn't a surprise. It was just honesty made public. Goodbye, freeloader, don't come back, asterisk. That wasn't some spontaneous burst of cruelty. That was the family mission statement printed large enough for the neighborhood. My Uncle Dean was on the patio already flushed from beer, waving a bottle around like he was preaching. Kelsey stood near the grill in cutoffs and full makeup, filming bits of the afternoon for social media because some people can't resist packaging humiliation if there's a chance for likes. My grandmother Lorraine sat beneath a patio umbrella wearing that pinched, righteous expression she used whenever somebody was being mean, for their own good. And my father Richard Bennett stood at the grill in an apron that said * boss of the grill * like he had been personally endorsed by the universe. When he saw me in the driveway, he spread his arms and said, "Look who finally came to collect her junk." Some of the neighbor women laughed because cruelty always sounds safer when it comes with potato salad and afternoon sunlight. I walked straight into the house, went to the laundry room, and found the last box. On top was a note written in black marker, "Starter kit, *." Inside were dryer sheets, ramen, a half-used roll of trash bags, and a printed list of apartment complexes in town. It was so theatrical it almost would have been funny if it hadn't been so pathetic. When I came back outside carrying it, Dean was shouting that my dead mother would be ashamed of what I had become. He knew exactly where to stab. My mother had been gone 9 years. Kelsey tossed the hot dog. People roared. My father didn't tell anyone to stop. That mattered more than the insults. In families like mine, leadership isn't wisdom, it's permission. The person at the top decides what cruelty others are allowed to perform. So I put the box in my trunk, lifted my phone, and took one picture of the banner with all of them smiling underneath it. My father called out, "What, collecting evidence for your therapist?" I looked at him and said the first words I had spoken there all day. "No, for later." Then I left. Silence terrifies people who are used to your labor appearing automatically. The first 3 days, nobody called. They thought they had won. That's how entitlement works. It mistakes absence for surrender right up until the machine starts rattling. The first real crack came Monday afternoon. One of my father's municipal clients rejected a permit resubmission because the insurance certificate attached to the file had expired. Normally I would have seen the notice, called the broker, forced a same-day update, and resent the package before anyone had time to panic. This time, the email sat untouched until the client copied my father directly and wrote, "Final delay before reassignment." He called me once. I watched it ring. Tuesday, the project management software shut down because the backup card on file was gone and the main card declined. Work orders, measurements, scheduling notes, materials tracking, all of it went dark until someone dealt with billing. My uncle called 3 times. No voicemail. Kelsey texted one sentence. Dad says stop being dramatic and log in. Wednesday morning, the workshop utility account generated a shutoff warning. I know because my father called at 7:12 a.m. using the voice he normally saved for pastors, bankers, and people whose approval he wanted. "Ava, sweetheart, call me when you get this. There's some confusion with the utility account. I think maybe your card was still attached somehow. We can straighten it out." Confusion. I almost admired the nerve. By Thursday, their tone changed. Dean left a voicemail that was less slurred than usual, which meant he was scared. He said he hadn't meant any of the party stuff. He said I knew how he got after a few drinks. He said if the company lost the vehicle wrap install scheduled for Friday, everybody would suffer. Everybody. That word gets used a lot in family systems after they've spent years isolating one person. Suddenly it's not about what was done to you. It's about everybody. I didn't respond. Friday was when business trouble turned into personal inconvenience, which meant Kelsey finally cared. She called crying. That told me immediately the stress had moved close enough to touch her. She said Dad was in one of his moods. Dean was blaming everyone. Grandma was saying God was punishing the house for pride. Then Kelsey got to the real reason for the call. She needed me to Venmo her $600 because the med spa had cut her hours and she was short on rent. Dad had promised to help, but payroll was weird and she was stressed and could I please not make this into a thing? That phrase followed me for years. Don't make it a thing. Asterisk. Don't make it a thing when Dean commented on my body. Don't make it a thing when my father used my room for storage and called me ungrateful for mentioning it. Don't make it a thing when Kelsey borrowed money and forgot. Don't make it a thing when Grandma compared me to younger women with husbands, babies, and pressed church dresses. My pain was always the thing. Their behavior was just weather. So I asked Kelsey, "Do you know why Dad can't help you?" She got quiet in that irritated younger sibling way that means she wants the truth but doesn't want to pay for it emotionally. "No," she said. "He just keeps saying cash flow is weird." "Cash flow is weird," I repeated. Then I laughed. That evening she texted again. Angry this time. She said I was punishing the family because my feelings were hurt. She said Dad had every right to kick me out if I wasn't contributing. She said normal adults paid rent. I sent her one screenshot. Not the whole file, just a cropped section of a spreadsheet showing 3 months of line items with her name, my father's company name, and the workshop utility account. Below it I wrote, "Since you're interested in contribution." She didn't answer for 2 hours. Then, "What is this?" I replied, "A sample." Saturday morning, My father called 6 times before noon. On the 3rd voicemail, the swagger was gone. On the 5th, the anger was too. By the 6th, all that remained was panic wearing formal clothes. Ava, please call me back. I'm asking as your father. We need to clear up exactly what you've been paying and what you turned off. Dean says the vendor account is restricted. The workshop power is pending disconnect. The truck insurance autopay bounced. If this is some kind of lesson. Okay, lesson learned. Please call me. Lesson learned. Not, I'm sorry. Not, we were wrong. Just the language of a man discovering his hidden infrastructure was a person. That afternoon, I put together something I had imagined in fragments for years. A packet, not emotional, not messy, clean, professional, 31 pages, cover sheet, timeline, amounts, screenshots, payment references, notes on emergency interventions, separate sections for company expenses, household support, direct family transfers, and unpaid labor. At the end, I included one image. The photo of the party banner hanging over the garage while my family laughed underneath it. I printed 2 copies, one for me, one for whoever might need to see the difference between their narrative and reality. I wasn't sure yet whether I would use it. Then Sunday, after church, my grandmother Lorraine left me a voicemail so sanctimonious it practically came with organ music. She said bitterness would rot my soul. She said my father had spoken harshly. But he was under pressure. She said humiliating family over money was ugly and unladylike. She said if I had really given out of love, I wouldn't be counting now. I called her back because I wanted a witness. You're right, I said. Generosity doesn't keep score. Accounting does. She went very still. Then I asked, Grandma, if I send you proof that Dad and Dean used me to hold that business together while calling me a freeloader, will you tell the truth for once? Or will you call that dishonor too? She didn't answer. That was my answer. An hour later, my father texted 3 words. Talk now. Please. I wrote back. Tomorrow. Noon. Public place. He immediately replied. Home. I stared at the message and felt something settle inside me. No, I typed. You wanted an audience when I left. You can have one when you ask why. We met Monday at a diner off the highway. One of those places where truckers drink burnt coffee and nobody blinks if somebody looks like they haven't slept in days. My father was already there when I arrived. His truck parked crooked like he'd pulled in too fast. Dean was with him, of course. Men like my uncle only believe a woman is serious once another man is close enough to witness it. Neither of them ordered food. I set the packet on the table. My father looked at it like paper itself was offensive. What is this? He asked. I slid it toward him. The difference between your story and mine. He opened it with the confidence of a man expecting nonsense. That confidence lasted seconds. His eyes dropped to the total on the first page, then snapped back up at me like the number had insulted him personally. Dean leaned over, read the same page, and muttered, Jesus Christ. I had arranged everything so there was no room for performance. Direct support total over 30 months. Company expenses covered or prevented. Personal transfers to family members. Screenshots of texts and voicemails. Missed filings and penalties I had resolved. Conservative estimates of unpaid labor. And at the end, the banner photo. No speech, no crying, just facts. My father flipped too hard through one section and said, This is ridiculous. You're inflating everything. Am I? He jabbed a finger at one line. This software wasn't for me. It was for the office. Yes, I said, your office, your company. Another line. These fuel payments were temporary. For 3 months, I said, all after you told me payroll was fine. Dean had gone pale. Then my father reached for the argument he trusted most. Families help each other. That doesn't mean you act like a debt collector. Interesting, I said, when I lived in your house. You called it freeloading, but when you lived off my money, it became family. He lowered his voice. Don't do this here. You mean with witnesses? Dean tried his own version. Ava, honey, I was drunk at the party. I didn't mean any of that. I looked at him. You didn't apologize when you sobered up. You apologized when the software shut off. He had nothing. My father changed direction. Fine. Maybe you helped more than we realized. You were still living in my house at 30. There it was. His whole theology. Shelter erased all debt owed downward. So I said, if I had paid market rent to a stranger and kept my money away from your business, you would have lost that workshop over a year ago. If I had billed you like a client for every fix, every rewrite, every deadline rescue, every compliance issue, every emergency transfer, you'd be bankrupt. The only reason you got to call me a freeloader is because I loved you quietly. That landed harder than the total. He flipped again until he found the banner photo. His whole posture shifted. Not sorrow. Risk assessment. You took this for leverage. He said. No, I took it because I knew you would pretend it wasn't that bad. Dean rubbed his face. So what now? What do you want? Nothing, I said. That's the part you still don't understand. I already paid. I'm just done. My father's jaw tightened. You can't walk away and let everything collapse over a grudge. I didn't leave because of a grudge. I said, I left because your disrespect finally cost more than my loyalty. He went quiet, only for a moment, then he asked the real question. How much of this can you turn back on? Not asterisk are you okay? Asterisk. Not asterisk we were wrong. Asterisk. Just operations. I answered him plainly. Some things can be fixed. Some can't. A few vendor accounts might reopen if you pay deposits. The workshop utilities might stay on if you act quickly. The truck insurance will cost more now. At least 2 clients are already damaged because no one was there to translate your emails into professional English. That one hit him where money couldn't. You're enjoying this, he said. No, I said, I would have enjoyed being noticed before it came to this. Then he tried what I think of as the widower voice. He said life had been hard since my mother died. He said he'd made mistakes. He said we shouldn't be sitting there like enemies. And for a second I almost believed the outline of it, not the substance. Pain can explain a person. It does not excuse what they build out of it. We're sitting here like enemies, I said, because you threw a party when you thought you no longer needed me. Whatever softness had flickered across him vanished. So what do you want? He asked. An apology? I said nothing. That silence unsettled him more than anger ever could. Then he did what he always did when shame came too close. He widened the circle. Grandma, Kelsey, Dean, the company, the family, everybody's needs were suddenly my job again. I reached into my bag and placed a second envelope beside the packet. Inside was a list of resources, local bookkeepers, a tax resolution service, a utility assistance program, and a small business attorney. What's this? He asked. Help, I said, the kind that isn't me. I stood up. He stopped me with one last warning. If you walk out now, don't expect to come back when things turn around. I picked up my keys and said, Dad, the only reason things ever turned around in that family was because I was standing behind you pushing. Then I left. I thought that diner meeting would be the ending. It wasn't. When you stop being the hidden support beam in a toxic family, the structure doesn't collapse all at once. It cracks in installments. A few days later, Grandma called again, not to apologize, to negotiate. She said everyone had behaved badly, which in family language means the person with proof is being asked to share blame with the people who caused the harm. She said we should sit down calmly, like Christians, and talk this through. I asked whether the banner had been Christian. She skipped right over that and moved to logistics. A truck had been sidelined because insurance lapsed. A client was withholding payment. If the company failed, she said, it would hurt the whole family. It already did, I told her. Then she used my mother. Because that was her favorite crowbar. She said my mother would hate this division. That line used to break me open. This time it didn't. No, I said. Mom would hate that her daughter was publicly humiliated by people who depended on her. For once, Grandma had no immediate scripture to throw. Then Kelsey showed up at my apartment in Colorado. She looked exhausted in a way I had never seen before, stripped of all the polish she usually wore like armor. At first she made shallow conversation, asking about the area, saying the drive was long, commenting on how cold it was compared to Arizona. Eventually the truth came out. Dad's company was unraveling. Dean had missed shifts. One of the printers had been sold. Grandma was furious about money. Dad kept insisting everything could still be fixed if I would stop being stubborn. Then Kelsey said the one thing I didn't expect. I was awful to you. No excuse, no performance, just the sentence. She admitted the hot dog thing was disgusting. She said she joined in because Dad was pleased. And being on the safe side of him had always felt easier than being in his path. Then she said the part that changed the way I saw all of us. When you were there, he aimed most of it at you. She said, now you're gone. He's turning on everyone. That was the family system in one line. Families like ours survive by feeding one person to the tension. Remove that person and the poison starts circulating. I asked her if she had ever really believed I was freeloading. She looked at the floor. No, I knew you were helping. I just didn't know how much. And if I admitted Dad was lying, everything in that house got scary. Cowardly, honest, human, not enough to erase anything. But still more truth than I had heard from most of them in years. I let her stay one night. My father went the other direction. He emailed me something titled *Family Resolution Proposal, which would have been funny if it weren't so revealing. In it, he offered me a 90-day contractor role to help stabilize operations. Compensation, he wrote, could be discussed later once cash flow improved. At the bottom he added that this arrangement would give me an opportunity to rebuild trust. Rebuild trust. I laughed out loud in my kitchen. I replied with 4 sentences. I am not returning. I am not providing unpaid or deferred labor. Do not contact me for business support again. Future communication should be respectful and personal only. He answered almost immediately. So that's it? You watch your father lose everything? I stared at that message for a long time because it pressed on the oldest bruise in me. Children raised the way I was raised are taught that if a parent sinks, we become flotation. We become the raft, the rope, the emergency fund, the apology, the labor, the silence. Finally I wrote back. You are not losing everything because I left. You are losing everything because you built a life that only worked while someone you despised kept carrying it. He never responded. A month later, my grandmother mailed back a casserole dish I had left at the house years ago. No note, just the dish, like returning glassware balanced the moral books. I laughed so hard I had to sit down. Not long after, Kelsey texted me that the house was going on the market. Not because Dad wanted to simplify. Because he had to. Then she sent one more message. He keeps saying you ruined him. I answered right away. No. I stopped protecting him from what he built. She wrote back 3 words. I know now. The house sold below asking in late summer. I know because public records are brutally clean. And sometimes closure looks less like a speech and more like a county database confirming that the house where you learned to disappear now belongs to strangers. Kelsey sent me a blurry picture of the moving truck. Grandma moved in with a cousin. Dean was sleeping on somebody's couch. My father rented a smaller place near the industrial strip and tried to keep Bennett Graphics alive. But 2 major accounts were gone. One supplier had switched them to cash-only terms. And the company no longer had anybody quietly preventing disaster in the margins. I did not go back. That mattered more than the house. The sale, the business, any of it. The real revenge was not watching them suffer. It was building a life that did not require their recognition to feel real. Colorado suited me in ways Arizona never had. 1 contract became 2. 2 became referrals. Then an LLC with deposits up front. Boundaries in writing. And clients who understood that expertise cost money. I rented a better place. Bought a used Subaru in cash. Learned what evenings felt like when there wasn't a manufactured crisis waiting in the next room. Peace felt strange at first. Toxic families train you to distrust calm. If nothing is exploding, part of you starts scanning for smoke anyway. About 5 months after the house sold, my father called from a number I didn't recognize. He said immediately that he wasn't calling about money, which told me he knew exactly what I would suspect. Then he said he had found one of my mother's recipe cards while packing and thought I might want it. That was the first thing he had offered me in years that wasn't wrapped around a demand. You can mail it, I said. There was a pause. Then he asked quietly, did you really think I was that cruel? I could have answered 100 different ways. I could have listed incidents. I could have repeated his words back to him. I could have reminded him of every time he looked away while other people hurt me because it was useful to him. Instead I said, you hung it over the garage. Dad. He exhaled. That was all. The recipe card arrived 4 days later. Chicken pot pie, written in my mother's handwriting. At the bottom, she had scribbled, add more time if Richard complains. I laughed so suddenly I cried. I framed it. People still ask whether I regret not helping one last time. The question sounds compassionate, but it hides the same old trap. It assumes the most moral person in the story is the one willing to sacrifice again. The one willing to save the same people who mocked, used, and erased her. The one willing to translate abuse into duty because the word family has been placed on top of it like a blessing. I don't believe that anymore. If someone calls you family only when they need your labor, your money, or your silence, they are not protecting a relationship. They are protecting a system. If a parent needs you to stay small so they can feel large, that isn't unconditional love. And if a whole household can laugh while you're humiliated, then panic the second your support disappears. That panic is your answer. I was never the freeloader. I was the hidden payroll, the emergency fix, the softener on bad emails, the midnight transfer, the woman keeping chaos from becoming consequence. My father's biggest mistake wasn't throwing the party. It was believing the person he humiliated would still keep the lights on afterward. The last message I ever got from Dean came on New Year's Eve. 3 words. You were right, asterisk. No punctuation, no apology, just that. I didn't answer. Kelsey and I talk now. But carefully, not like movie sisters, more like 2 women testing whether honesty can grow in soil poisoned by comparison. She left Arizona too, found steadier work. Sometimes she calls with practical adult questions. And sometimes I answer, when I choose to. That distinction matters more than most people understand. And I still have the photo. The banner over the garage. Smoke rising from the grill. My father in his absurd apron. Dean half drunk on the patio. Kelsey laughing mid-throw. All of them so certain they were documenting my humiliation. What they actually captured was the final second before their safety net got into her car and drove away. So no, I don't regret leaving. I regret staying long enough to confuse being used with being loved. I regret every year I translated disrespect into responsibility because I thought endurance made me virtuous. But I do not regret the silence. I do not regret the photo. I do not regret the packet, the distance, the move, or the moment I finally understood that rescuing people who despise your help is not loyalty. It is self-erasure. My father begged 2 weeks later. By then, it was already too late. If you want, I can do one more pass and make this even more YouTube ready by adding stronger pause beats for AI voice, splitting it into short narration paragraphs, making it sound even more dramatic and cinematic for retention.